Hey folks, welcome to Smart Simple Fit. Today, got a real treat for you. I'm going to be speaking with Alec Enkiri, someone who's pretty well known on YouTube Fitness. I would say is a reliable source of information, especially for strength training and for natties. He is one who has exposed some of the goofy controversies in YouTube Fitness, whether it's the Athlete X thing and various other ones. So he's really earned my respect over the years, and his information has also helped me a great deal in my own training personally. So, Alec, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Awesome, awesome. So, I'd love for the audience to get a little bit of a taste for your background. What got you passionate about exercise in the first place? What were some of the things you focused on way back then, and how has your training changed along the way? Whether that's some of the exercises, maybe what your own personal goals are, and then possibly you can tell us about aspirations for the future. Tell us all about yourself.
Uh, Thank you. So my personal goals have changed quite substantially over the years. What kind of got me started initially, it was so I always played sports, but really what got me into the weight room was not that I wanted to get better at sports, but it was just the fact that I was so darn skinny is really what got me started. So I was basically when I was in my early teens, I was pretty much a twig. So I started with just calisthenics, essentially push-ups and sit-ups is what really got me started, and I put on a little bit of body weight that way, and that started getting me a little bit hooked on the process. After that, I graduated. I bought myself a barbell set, or not a barbell set, but just a barbell and a bench, and I graduated to bench press and curls. Did that for a little while, and then I kind of once I got access to my university weight room was where things really started to progress for me. So that was where I learned about things like powerlifting and Olympic lifting. And from there, I took an interest really in both of those things, and I kind of springboarded from there. So I didn't really focus on anything in particular as I was going through college. I was just kind of soaking up a lot of knowledge. Um, and then it was kind of once I graduated from there, I really started falling in love with Olympic lifting actually initially. So that was where I had started to learn more about the performance aspects of things. I had felt those aspects for myself. I had seen my athletic performance improve just from general strength training. So that kind of got me hooked on Olympic lifting afterwards. Man, I don't know. It's a long journey.
Yeah. When did you
I
do
don't
your first
remember actually.
powerlifting meet? Do you remember?
What it was 2014. So I was gonna say it was shortly after that. Like Olympic lifting was fun for me, but frustrating for me. So it lasted there for a little bit, but I didn't last too long, and I kind of segued into powerlifting after that. And I ended up in that little phase for a few years. It ended up only actually being like 2 or 3 years. I think I did my first meet 2014. Last one I think I did early 2017. So that phase didn't last too long either. And honestly, I'm glad because I kind of got I even in not even just in retrospect, but even at the time, I could feel kind of with that emphasis on primarily powerlifting stuff. I could feel like obviously I was strong. That was kind of my
Oh yeah.
peak strength, but I could feel negative changes in my own body that I didn't like. So I started losing other physical qualities by pigeonholing myself into that realm. Is kind of the way I look at it, and that's not necessarily something that absolutely has to occur, but I think it's something that often does occur, and it is something that was occurring with me. So then I kind of got into YouTube, uh, basically towards the end of when I was really emphasizing powerlifting style stuff. And since then, honestly, I in some respects, I credit what I have been doing on YouTube for part of the evolution of my training, for not like teaching me about the kind of stuff that you see now, but for really expanding my mind again, like showing, reminding me of that kind of stuff. It got me kind of back into that realm, and that has really allowed me to evolve to kind of what you guys are seeing today. So I think that has been a good thing for me because honestly, that's really what my main passion actually is that kind of athletic emphasis stuff and just the overall well-rounded fitness concept because I was always fit, I was always athletic. And so it's really just like it's what I enjoy doing is
Yeah.
kind of not necessarily playing sports, but moving my body more so than just always being in the weight room, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And for you guys listening who've seen a number of Alec's videos, I know I've watched a ton of his videos over the years. to see the heavy carries, the sprints, the really high jumps, it's very impressive. So, to see these physical qualities trained in an effective program and then put to the test, even if it's not in an actual sport environment or competition, there's something really satisfying about making those improvements. And I mean, between the box jumps and the hundreds of pounds on the carries, the sprints, I find it quite impressive. So what was that one that you did the highest jump?
Box
That
jump.
yeah.
The highest box I've jumped onto was 60 inches, so 5 feet.
That's wild.
Um,
That's wild.
that yeah, that was I couldn't do that right now because I was a good bit lighter when that happened, but that was a lot of fun. It's once you kind of like get into, like you were saying, once you kind of get into the zone with something like that, those do end up being for me the most satisfying types of PRs, like that box jump, my vertical jump. When you somehow manage to increase your sprinting speed, it's like, because those are the kinds of things where people always want to tell you you can't do that. That can't be done. You're born with it or you're not. And you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, to an extent, but also to an extent, you can improve it. And so that really does make it those are the most satisfying types of
I think
PRs.
so. Yeah. So I know that you're fairly fond of the knees over toes stuff, that sort of approach, and he would agree with that a lot, as far as
Mhm.
like, it's not eternally destined whether you're going to dunk or not. That's actually something you could even improve, and he's a good
Right.
testimony to that, and your performance increases are testimony to that too. So it's not only unfortunate that we see the whole like genetic or you're built for it, your body, you're blessed with whatever. It's not just like that in the bodybuilding and strength context. You see a lot of that across the board. Oh, someone's naturally talented, right? As if to imply that someone else is going to be wasting their time by investing a great deal of effort going on a journey to improve. So that's
Right.
always unfortunate to see. But
Well,
you're living proof against it. You're living proof, man.
eh, but the thing is, even that, and it's something I've actually kind of randomly been thinking about a lot lately. Even that notion, that sentiment of you're either born with it or you're not. Let's even disregard everything that you see that athlete doing now as a fully formed athlete, right? The fact that
Yeah,
they're still training hard, they're still busting their ass.
true.
That whole concept disregards everything that they've done for their entire life. Like, is there a genetic component? Maybe, but we could take two twins and we could have one guy do all the athletic stuff growing up, play all the sports,
Oh
do
yeah,
all the S&C type stuff, and become a freak. And then his twin brother could become a sedentary nothing. Because the whole culmination of it really is years and years of adaptations just being stacked on top of each other. And it kind of like it does, as you were before we got started talking about things that grind my gears. Well, I didn't have any off the top of my head, but there you go. That one grinds my gears. You're going to ignore 20 or 30 years of somebody's lifetime and all the things they've done getting to where they are and just chalk it up to genetics. That's kind of crappy.
totally, man, totally. And there's so many great examples of that. Like whether you take even two kids in high school, one of them grew up on a farm doing farm chores. Well,
Right.
that's hard work versus someone who has a very like cushy, lifestyle, just playing the video games, being sedentary
Right.
all the time. That makes a difference. Or in the
Right.
case of Sam Sheether, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He did his background, like a lot of people, right? Background in like martial arts before going into like strength training. For him, it was a ton
Okay.
of push-ups. Well, of
Okay.
course, training push-ups is going to make a difference on bench press at the start. So it'd be kind of fallacious if we are like, wow, look how strong someone is starting, after like
Starting.
5 years of like progressive overload on push-ups.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you can't. That's the thing. You can't ignore somebody's history, but when we don't know people, that's kind of what we just inevitably end up doing, which is unfortunate.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, as far as like going into the deeper into what you're passionate about, as far as the, training for performance, what are the things, what would be like the top priorities other than like just the normal basics of like consistency, quality of reps and progressive overload track, other than those like stuff that we all probably take for granted at this point as being the big picture? What do you think are the top priorities for someone who is interested in a training style similar to you, where it's about that explosive performance and that sort of thing? What should they keep in mind?
I think the main thing there, this is something I've sort of meant to make a video on, but haven't really gotten around to it. I call it the power of intent. I think I actually wrote about it in my conjugate manual. And that is the concept of putting your all into every single rep that you do. Max, what I write in my programs when we're talking about this style of work, I call it maximal effort, maximal aggression, maximal intent. Basically, the goal of trying to basically be violent in whatever you're doing. That doesn't necessarily sound like the best thing when you say it out loud, but you improve power, you improve explosiveness, rate of force development, all of those things by trying to be violent, by giving maximal aggression and maximal intent into whatever it is you happen to be doing. It could be a medicine ball throw or slam. It could be an Olympic lift. It could be a jump. It could be a high pull. It could be a swing. Anything. When you're being explosive, you have to be explosive. And I think that it sounds simple, right? But I think that a lot of people lack that ability. They lack the ability to go from 0 to 100 instantaneously because it's not really something that a lot of people do. And that would probably be something I think you can teach it, at least to an extent. You can certainly improve that concept. But I think that's something where you would start to notice a lot of difference between somebody who was, let's say, sedentary from age 0 to age 15 or 20 versus somebody who played any kind of sport or who did any kind of physical activity as they were growing up. It's kind of like with athletic things. The way I liken it is like kind of learning a new language, right? If you're learning a new language when you're really young, it's a lot easier, right? If you're learning a new language when you're fully developed, it can be done, but it's a lot more difficult, and you're probably going to have an accent at the end of it, right? So it's kind of the same thing, in my opinion. It's better to start earlier, but it's still something that you can work with.
Awesome. And then how would you strike a balance between, so you want, the goal is to do everything with the highest intent possible. How do you strike
Or
a balance between
explosiveness.
explosive?
Right.
How would you strike the balance between it? Let's say it comes down to discipline, just putting it in, like really giving it your gusto, versus making good choices in a program so that there's not superfluous work, like just cramming in extra exercises or extra volume or extra frequency that might not necessarily need to be there. Is there a point where for most people it just comes down to discipline, and then once you're already excelling, making sure that you're not biting off more than you can chew? How do you balance that?
Well, that should be part of the parameters of the program, if nothing else, because it shouldn't have a bunch of junk volume to begin with. The way I'll typically do it with something like that, with the explosive exercises, the goal was always quality, right? So typically the reps will be low. I mean, depending on the movement, if you're doing like a swing, for example, the reps are going to be a little bit higher than, say, a power clean, generally speaking, because of the rhythmic nature of the movement. That lets you get a little bit more reps in, whatever. But anyway, so the goal was rep quality. So typically you'll have a cap just on the number of reps somebody would do, and then you'll give them a little bit of wiggle room in terms of the number of sets that they can do. Right. So maybe you'll say like 3 sets here on a bad day, or if you're still performing well, you can go up to 5 sets or 6 sets or something like that. And again, some exercises lend themselves better to more, some to less. But basically the point is, as long as rep quality stays high, as long as performance stays high, that's typically the indicator. So as long as you're going all out and resting sufficiently, then and making sure that you're tracking the metrics that we need to be tracking, then you can kind of make those decisions in the middle of the game, right? The game time decisions. But it always comes back down to performance. If the general rule is, let's say, you always start from here, right? And then you kind of ramp up when you're doing something like a jump or a sprint until you hit your best level for the day. The goal at that point is to either make those really small gains from set to set, or keep the level of performance static. And then once you see you've hit that peak for the day, once the numbers start trickling down, that's kind of your indicator. That's where, okay, this is not as productive anymore, so now I'm going to stop. As productive anymore for the goal of building maximal power or maximal explosiveness. It would still do other things, but it won't. If you're not at the ceiling with power, you're not breaking new ground, essentially.
Yep, that seems
Does
pretty
that make
reasonable
sense?
to me. Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. That seems very reasonable. Emphasis on productivity, emphasis on
Right.
quality performance.
Right.
Yeah, great. Now, how would you say your training typically? How is that distinguished from bodybuilding?
uh, I would say exercise selection primarily. So I can't even necessarily say rep work. I can to an extent because you'll still see me doing things like heavy singles on squats, different squatting variations or overhead press variations, because I'm still kind of using that conjugate style to an extent. But I have also started doing a lot of high rep work as well. So, for example, this past week, what I did was I hit a heavy Anderson squat. Then I went into Hatfield squats, and I actually did a Widowmaker set, a set of 20, which would be reminiscent of bodybuilding. And then I did some 15s on my good mornings. So all that stuff is
Oh
actually
yeah,
not all that far removed from that realm. But I think the exercise selection in general is going to be a big thing because a week ago I went out to the field and I ran in circles. Literally, I was doing circle sprints. And no bodybuilder is going to be doing that. I'll do targeted work for the hip flexors. That's not typically something you'll see. My ab work is not going to be not generally dynamic things. That I don't focus on dynamic things that are going to build the size of the hypertrophy of the abdominal muscles. I don't really care. So like I'm doing a lot of different rollout variations. I'll often do plank variations as well. Um, Things of that nature, targeting muscles that they don't necessarily care about, adding in a lot of different explosive types of things, jumps and sprints and Olympic lifts. And that's probably the biggest differences, to be honest.
yeah. Well, it's really fun to watch, like the heavy stuff with the squats, front squats, off the pins, deep in the hole. Like these are uncomfortable positions that I think a lot of people avoid, and I think
Right.
you'd be able to speak to their benefits of, exposing yourself to that stimulus, building the skill, and be quite beneficial, right?
Right.
So,
Well, yeah, those are some of my favorites. To be honest, the front squat is my favorite, probably my favorite squatting variation. And I have recently fallen in love again with going, basically trying to get as deep as I can with them. Something I had moved away from with the powerlifting stuff. I still always front squatted with powerlifting because it always helped my back squat. But once you're into that world, there's pretty much no incentive to go below parallel the powerlifting world, obviously, because the rules are to go to parallel essentially. Uh, but once I've kind of moved back out into the generalized thing, it becomes obvious to somebody like me, my hips just feel a lot better when I'm working fuller ranges of motion, even my knees too. But my hips, not only they just feel less bound up, right? So like if I'm sitting on the floor or something, just the way that you can kind of maneuver around on there, and for me that's like, why not? Because I'm gonna squat anyway, but now I have more hip mobility and I'm not trying. It's just something I was already going to do, but by squatting deeper, it's got me being more, we'll say, functional in other facets of my life. So for me, that's just a why not type of thing, right?
yeah, yeah, I think that's a great perspective. And then, you've done such a great job calling out various trends, in my opinion, over the years in the fitness industry. And obviously, some of what we're touching on there when we talk about like mobility and stuff like that, some of that can become memeified, right? Or variations can definitely become memeified. But
Sure.
if we're being as realistic as possible, how much of a role do you think mobility plays on performance? And then also the execution of like those heavier movements like the squat? How important is mobility?
Well, for the squat, it's going to depend on, I mean, the applicable joints for starters, but it's going to depend on what your goal depth is, basically, as well as your anthropometry to an extent. But let's say you're decently built for squatting. So it's really just going to depend then, do you want to be able to go really deep or do you want to just stop at parallel, right? If you want to be able to go really deep, then you got to have the hip mobility and the ankle mobility and the knee flexibility to be able to do it. Otherwise, you're going to run into issues. You're just what's going to happen is you're going to it, even if you force it, right? You're going to end up in shitty positioning, and then that shitty positioning is going to lead to you being basically weak. You can't produce maximal force from suboptimal positions essentially. So if nothing else, you run into that. You run into becoming an inefficient type of lifter, which is not what we want. Um, Could you repeat the rest of the question? Again, getting all
Yeah,
sidetracked.
I think that's right because I think what you're getting at is you need to prepare yourself for the position that you
Sure.
plan to be in, right? And if
Right.
you expect your performance to be high in that position, mobility is just another element of being prepared for that position.
Yes. So in terms of you wanted to know about in terms of like athleticism or that kind of thing
Yeah,
as
sure.
well. Uh so I think there is a I think there's like a threshold basically. So if you're stiff as a freaking piece of cardboard or not cardboard but wood and whatever, if you're like the Tin Man, obviously that's going to be impactful, right? Even just sprinting has certain degrees of mobility that are required. You have to be able to, the higher that your legs tend to drive up, that your hips tend to drive up, the more power you can typically generate. There's also an internal rotation component to that when you're sprinting. So even just something simple like that, there are like requisite degrees of mobility that you need. um, if you're at those thresholds, you're probably not going to experience any issues, right? Because there isn't necessarily a deficit for what you're trying to achieve. Now, if you start talking about something that's less predictable, so something where there's a lot of contact, you're talking about, say, football or something versus just sprint, if you're a track runner, that's very predictable as to what you're going to be doing. Nobody's going to knock into you. Nothing weird's going to happen. You're just running. So you have that requisite mobility. You're going to be fine. Now you want to talk about something like a contact sport like football, or even something like basketball or tennis where you're moving your body about in crazy ways because you're reacting to other stimuli. You might end up sliding your foot out from underneath of you, those sorts of things. Once you add that element of unpredictability, I think it behooves you to have a little bit more potential mobility to tap into because you could potentially end up in a weird position. Even especially again something like football where you're going to get knocked all over the place, you can end up in weird positions and you don't want to be excessively tight or whatever because that's how bad shit happens. Now, do I think that you need to be that, like we see like I would call them mobility gods, that people, some of the people that I see on YouTube and stuff, and I've had clients talk to me about that kind of thing because like people see that and they're like, wow, that's awesome and I want to be able to do that. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. That's cool. I kind of want to be able to do it too. But is the goal to be able to do that just for its own sake? Or is the goal to be able to do that because we think it has some other value? And once you start talking about excessive mobility, it's what I would call excessive mobility. I don't think it really has any value beyond itself, right? So unless it's just something that you really want to achieve for its own sake, then you are kind of wasting your time assuming that you have that threshold that you require for whatever you're doing already in place.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I think that's a really good answer. And you know, you can just think of like obvious examples like doing full splits, Van Damme style on the chairs, right? Get like fully out at the hips. That looks really cool. Like that's a
Yeah.
great thing to do for its own sake, but it probably doesn't mimic a position that you'll actually be in unless we're talking like some kind of a dance or martial art or something like that. In which case, that might be a great example. But for football, when you get tackled, you're probably not going to land in a Van Damme split. If you did, that'd be great. But
Not to that. So yeah, not
yeah,
like that would be an example of very excessive
very
abduction
yeah,
capacity. And it's like, yes, I do want to be able to split out. I do want to be able to abduct my hips to a decent extent, but I probably don't need to be able to be a pancake to be
crotch to
able
the
to do
ground. Yeah.
anything.
Now on the flip side, you know, it's hard to say how much of this comes from the academic realm of people who maybe are removed from having to test their ideas in practice. I think you and I would both be able to give a good critique of when someone spends too much time in the classroom and not enough time in the weight
Right.
room, you know, or enough time on the court actually testing their ideas. That's a problem. But you'll hear about excessive mobility, like, oh, you're too tight, you're too loose here, and that's a risk, right? You know, do you
Right.
think there's really a problem in having too much mobility, like hypermobility? Is
I
that really a risk?
think I think that is typically a side effect of weakness. So that's something you're going to see more often in like younger kids or in girls, right? You're going to see a joint laxity is what you're going to see. You're going to see where they can do something with their wrist or their hip or whatever. And you look at it and you're like, what the hell is going on right now? And I don't know, maybe like that could potentially be problematic, but it would be problematic if you can't essentially it becomes problematic when you can't stabilize it, right? When
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can't resist it, especially if again you're in a sporting situation and you're being forced into a position, but now you can't effectively resist from that position. So that's where the strength comes into play. And what you find is that once somebody gets a little bit stronger, those sorts of things, like people do actually tend to lose a little bit of mobility in some of their joints if they, especially if they are overly lax, right? Very mobile, hypermobile, whatever. Then they will lose some mobility at the end range. But I don't think that's a bad thing because once you're reaching those really extreme positions, it's in my experience typically a side effect of just being weaker than you probably want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say weak, and then I might add too as well an experience, right? Going back to spending time in those positions, right? Getting used to it
Okay.
is going to translate to more control, right? So
Right. Sure.
strength. I would tend to agree. And like even my own experience with clients, it hasn't hypermobility really hasn't been much of a problem. I would say like the only examples might be like you said, joint laxity. I think that's a good term for it. Or in females, sometimes just they tend to be like extremely flexible, or the joints.
Right.
Someone when they straighten their arm, it goes significantly past that kind of neutral point. And I've had clients where for them, full range of motion on the overhead press stopped shy of full extension. I'd say, hey, we'll shoot for this position because your arms can go way past, right? And that position doesn't feel good for you. Is it really that dangerous? I don't know, and I don't want to find out the hard way. So let's just create a consistent rep quality that feels good and is like a genuine attempt to get the weight all the way up. Like we're not
Right.
content with a cheat rep, but this is going to feel good for you. Full range of motion for someone else would stop 10 degrees ago. So for you, we're just going to
Right.
shave off the last 10 just in case, right?
Well, and the ironic part is you'll have some people like that. They'll have a person who can literally bend themselves in half, fold themselves over completely in half, and then that person will say, my hamstrings feel tight. My hamstrings always feel tight." And they're like, they are objectively not tight. And so it's not. We know it's not a full restriction, right? So it's something going on with the nervous system, and what would happen would probably be get that person a little bit stronger in the posterior chain, and that tightness is magically going to go away. And that's something I also experienced myself, but on the opposite, it was my hip flexors. So when all I did was squat heavy, my hip flexors felt really tight all the time. You stand up and you feel like you feel like you can't walk, right? You feel like you can't extend the leg back behind you. What you'll find out, what you'll see a lot of times in a case like that, you balance all of that hip extension, right? It's all in the weight room. It's always hip extension, hip extension, hip extension. You start to balance that out with a little bit of hip flexion, and then you come to find that things actually start to feel a lot better after a little time. So that's something I experienced myself. It was kind of a chronic feeling of tightness in the hip flexors, and that has dissipated to a large extent once I started actually training them.
Yeah, that's a very relatable experience that just some basic antagonistic work can be very
Right.
beneficial. And I've had a similar experience with deadlifts. Like first year getting into heavy deadlifts, no hip flexor work, and then after doing like the heavier sessions, especially if it was reps, let's say 5 or fewer, you'd feel some like uncomfortable tension in and around like the SI joint area, and just doing some basic hip flexion work on the same day after, and just doing even like leg raises, right? Like even
Right.
that made a lot of that sensation disappear just by doing some basic
Right.
antagonist work. But now, one of the concepts I saw you talk about in one of your recent videos the last few weeks is carryover. I have some passionate takes on the topic of carryover. I saw your video, so I know your views have evolved over time on that. Do you want to just give your sort of synopsis of what you think about carryover and its relevance?
So in that video, I think I was talking about how I feel that we view it as an industry. Essentially, we view
Yeah,
it mostly through the lens of powerlifting, right? Just the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. It kind of, for whatever reason, has become like a default frame of reference for a lot of people. And I don't think it needs to be. So, like, a lot of the stuff that I do now is not going to help me put more weight onto my back squat. It's not going to help me bench press more. It's not going to help me deadlift more, conventional deadlift or sumo deadlift off the floor. So 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it is, I would have told you, even personally would have told you, that's probably a waste of time, right? It's not making me stronger because I can't see it like that. But that's a myopic view, in my opinion. It just because an RDL doesn't automatically allow me to put more weight onto a conventional deadlift doesn't mean that there's no value to the RDL. It doesn't mean that I'm not building hamstring strength. It doesn't mean that I'm not building meat on the backside of my body. But there's also other benefits that those sorts of things can potentially give you. So if you want, again, with that same example, I'm never going to build strength at maximal length with a conventional deadlift, but I can do that with an RDL or even something like Good Morning or any true hinge where you're now loading through the eccentric phase and you can focus on reaching maximal length in the hamstrings before you move into the concentric portion of the lift. So there's other benefits to be had. And when you are viewing everything through that singular lens of, does this give me more weight on the bar here? It's typically squat bench deadlift, but it can be whatever you happen to have in your head as like, this is the metric that matters, right? So once you stop viewing it through the lens of, does A go into B or does B go into C or all that, once you stop trying to connect all of these dots, I think it gives you a little bit more freedom in what you're doing. I also think it lets you become more well-rounded overall because you're not so concerned about what in the grand scheme of things are actually relatively minor things. And what I concluded in that video basically is like, a strong person is a strong person, right? If all I do is conventional deadlift, I'm probably going to be able to get to whatever my mile marker that I wanted to get to. I'll probably reach it faster than if I take a comprehensive approach. But if I take a comprehensive approach, in the long run, I will probably be able to do more on even whatever my primary exercise was, just because in general, I am stronger. I am better off. I've created a more formidable system overall.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what that was.
No, I definitely agree with that. In multiple ways. Like, you can get too narrow-minded in thinking squat, bench, deadlift, or any exercise. And I think you need to have an honest sort of analysis or conversation with yourself where it's like, okay, am I really like focusing on each exercise? Going back to what you talked about intent. If I'm just doing something for its carryover, am I giving it its best intent, like for that exercise?
Right.
Because if so, you're going to want to try and improve on that. But by focusing on that, you do at some point, depending on the variation, especially, you move away from that specific thing. So you can't get too caught up in, oh, this is going to be so great for my squat. It's good to do front squats for their own right. It's a good exercise, right?
Right.
And being that comprehensive guy, being well-rounded, I tend to agree that is a great way to look at it, being well-rounded. Someone I had on the podcast a couple months ago, Adam Ogilvy from SAF Athletics, he's got a ton of experience, and he said do all the lifts, but he means like, the normal stuff, right? Not the goofy ones with the Bosu balls, but like,
I follow him on Instagram.
Yeah, behind the neck and front squat, back squat, overhead, all that stuff. So yeah, definitely. Yeah.
No, and that's a good way to do it. And he's got to be in his 50s at least, and he's still pushing things. I see him doing throws all the time. He's doing the behind the neck work, and he does a lot of different types of things, front squats as well. A lot of things that a lot of guys his age would say, "Oh, you can't do that anymore," or my knees hurt just looking at you, or whatever. But that's a testament to that. If you're doing that kind of stuff, it's gonna go a long way. So that's cool. Yeah, I look up to him for sure.
100%. Me too. He's a good influence. And going back to carryover, I think another problem too is people build expectations. Like, they'll go on to look up certain videos where it's like, oh, this exercise is great because of how much it carryovers. And then the person explaining it in the video is like, you can expect this percent, right? So however strong you are here, this percent here is this, right? Yeah.
And it's not the way it works. Like, maybe that's the way it works for that guy.
Right.
And it probably won't even work that way for that guy a second time, right? It'll work that way for him once. Maybe it'll work for you. Maybe it won't. Nobody, like, there's no way to know. And the thing is, because I'm kind of guilty of that myself, is like, okay, here, I know that if I add X to my front squat, I'm probably going to add Y to my back squat, was how it was back in the day. I guarantee you, like, I almost don't even back squat at this point anymore. And so I suck at it, basically. Like, I can basically front squat as much as I can back squat at this point. But like, I could go at, so before it was like automatic, right? It was like if I added 20 pounds or 50 pounds to the front squat, the next day I could put that extra amount on the back squat and nail it. Now it would probably take me freaking months to do that. And I have added significant amounts of strength to my front squat in recent history, just across like a bunch of different variations. But basically, yes, it kind of becomes a crapshoot. It depends on the person. It depends on where that person is. Like, it depends on the moment of time, like what that person has been doing lately. It's just there's too many other factors, too many variables at play to give anything really concrete in that regard.
100%. Well, yeah, you could just imagine that scenario too, right? If you were training front squats and back squats simultaneously, and so you're treating it like a variation, that's very different than if you weren't doing any back squats. You know, to expect it to have it like, okay, I haven't back squatted 3 months, time to add 50 pounds to it today. It's probably not going to work out.
Well, the funny part is, even if I was going cyclically, it would still work very similar to that. So before, it was always like my goal was 80%, right? So 80% of the front squat to back squat. So I would back squat, back squat, back squat until I would stall out. Then I would stop. I'd switch to the front squat and I would do it for a few months, because what would happen is you'd back squat for a little while, and then the front squat PR would drop to 70 or 75% in the back squat, right? So then I would build the front squat back up to whatever 80% of the back squat was. Then I would go back, and within like 1 or 2 weeks, even after not back squatting for 2 months or whatever it was, I'd be able to hit big PRs. So that happened one time where I literally, it was like a week, I don't remember. It was a couple weeks after resuming back squatting, and I had 50 extra pounds on the bar. So it was awesome. Like, it was very predictable, but that wouldn't happen for me anymore. Like, it's just things are just different now, you know? So
yeah. And there's something to be said for experience. If at the time you're already very experienced on the back squat too, you know, versus someone who's very new to it, a front squat and a back squat. I mean, there's a pretty, in my opinion, a fairly heavy investment of time, just like getting comfortable with the movement. You know, it's hard not to struggle with it as a beginner, just like hitting depth, the control, you know, keeping your feet, getting that nice even foot pressure, things like that. So if we're talking about someone who's not a complete beginner, yeah, maybe you could go longer without training a specific variation. It'll come back that much quicker based on, like we've talked about already, previous experience, training history.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. All right. So
but that's the funny thing too. Is no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I want to hear more.
Even as you change, like, as you kind of evolve as a lifter, your technique always sort of changes as well. It's never, people think it's like mastery is achieved and then your technique is like this static thing, but it's not. It can still regress, right? If you're not paying attention, and it can still evolve. Not even like get better or worse, but it can just kind of make lateral changes to where what it was before isn't what it was now. Things just kind of naturally gravitate in different directions over time. And that is going to probably, because now it's the same person, it's the same anthropometry, it's probably muscular emphases at that point that are changing, like muscular dominances that are changing what your body naturally gravitates towards. So even something minor like that is going to impact a ratio that you have in your head that you should be able to achieve. So my predictable, if I add 20 pounds here, I add 40 pounds here, or whatever it is, now maybe if the muscular dominance is different, that's not going to happen for me anymore. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And even body weight too. If someone starts off, you know, like going back to your story, I can relate to that a lot. I was probably 5'9" and like 130 pounds in high school. And so it's like, to work out got me to be less anorexic and Ethiopian looking, right?
Right.
But if you start off that journey and then you commit to powerlifting and that same frame, you become 300 pounds, right? That's going to influence how you squat a little bit.
Yes, that will influence
Yeah,
it for sure. I've never personally experienced such a drastic,
yeah,
rapid increase in weight, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. You know, of course, a decade, but yeah, for sure. Awesome. All right, so here's another topic that I think you've got some passionate things on. This ties into social media a lot, whether it's people like Body promoting certain physiques and ways of training, or even Athlete X. Like we see leanness sort of promoted as a virtue, whether that's for maybe it's purported for athleticism, how you look, how people will perceive you, even in the dating realm. Leanness, a lot of emphasis is banked on that. Obviously, it looks great, right? So it's going to sell. Now, how do you approach body composition within the context of training? How much does being lean really matter versus fat? Is there a realistic percentage to recommend? Should people worry about their body fat percent much at all? What do you think?
I have not at a single point in time been able to tell you what my body fat percentage was or is personally. Obviously, we can look at pictures and we can guess.
Yeah.
I think in general, it's not something I would get hung up on. It's
Yeah.
something I encourage people not to get hung up on.
Yep.
Obviously there's lots of things to consider. There's health for one. So if you get too fat, then health kind of becomes a question of concern. That's the main thing, in my opinion. Secondary to that then becomes, for somebody like me, how your body is performing. So obviously there's going to be a sweet spot for something like for strength. Obviously being a little bit fluffier is going to be beneficial, just because you can eat as many calories as you want, that kind of thing. For somebody like me, there's going to be a sweet spot in terms of strength levels and how that reconciles against how I'm able to move my body. If I get too fat, I won't be able to move well. As I get ultra lean, like when I was very lean before, I could move pretty well, but I carried no size on me, right? I was too tiny and I was weaker because of that, because of the lack of size. With other people, you have to consider how they look. They want to look a certain way. They have an image in their head. I think that the biggest issue for people like that, because that's aesthetics is the most popular kind of thing on YouTube fitness. I think the biggest issue with people like that is Body looks so good because he's fucking jacked first and foremost, right? It's not just because he is 8% body fat or whatever he is. It's because he's jacked. He would look good at 10%. He would look good at 12% because he carries muscle. You get a lot of really skinny guys who are like, well, I want to look like that, so I have to get down to 6% body fat. And you're like, fine, but you got to put a little bit of muscle on your frame first, or we're going to be very disappointed when we get there. Also, in my experience, it's easier to do that when you are carrying the muscle to begin with. It's easier to get lean. It's easier to stay lean when you have a decent amount of muscle on your frame. It's metabolically active tissue. Some people might call bullshit on that, but no, I think it's
agree.
easier to.
I agree with
okay.
you. Yeah, for sure.
So
well, and it's
I think
like
that's the biggest pitfall. Go ahead.
And even if they lose some muscle, right? If he loses a few pounds of muscle to get to that point by being jacked, he still looks good. He still looks good when we get there. Just like Alpha Destiny, right? Like two very impressive, I guess, transformations we could even touch on. Jeffrey and Alex, right? Alex Leonidas, like those guys look great. They definitely lost some strength and size to get there, but just like Body, they looked amazing when they got down there. And we could discuss whether it's ever worth getting that low, like stage ready, but I think it stands to reason the more advanced you are, the more developed you are, you're going to look better, be able to maintain it better, that sort of thing. Like I totally agree with that. Yeah. And it's not worth it as a beginner to try and like, okay, let me get down to 6% and then get jacked. It's like, no, get jacked and then you can worry about shaving off some fluff later, right?
And it's no coincidence that that's exactly what those two guys promote. If you follow any of their content, that's what you see. They're like, oh, well, I'm building right now. I'm building. Okay, now I'm cutting. Okay, now I'm building. It's like that's 90% of it is building. And then the cutting is a very small percentage of the work that's done.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any interest in doing something like that yourself? Getting down to like stage ready percentages?
No, not like that. I know at
Me neither.
best I would consider like I don't know cutting at this point the most I would consider is I think I'm carrying more lean mass than I've ever carried. I'd consider dropping a little body fat just to see what the whole thing looks like at this point. That is like you'd have to flip a coin 1,000 times to get me to actually agree to that. So I don't know that you'll ever actually see that come to fruition. But I would never ever. There's no chance in hell that you're going to see me doing what Alex or Jeff just did. It's just I'm not. I'm not willing to take the tanking of how I would be able to sprint and jump and all that kind of shit. I just don't care enough.
So fair. I will say it has been. I don't know how much you've been watching his comeback, but Alex in particular, his like bench press comeback since
Yeah,
starting to bulk after it has actually been very impressive to watch. His gains,
it has
rebounds, and
been.
explodes. So
Yeah, I've seen his stuff mostly on Instagram, but yeah, it has been very impressive.
awesome, awesome. And then on the note of like body composition and building that sort of thing, people talk about gaining and bulking and cutting and that sort of thing. Here's a new interesting take that I've actually seen from multiple people. I like. Well, I've seen Paris Butler, Bald Omni Man, talk about this a little bit. Gravity training. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And this is this. Yeah, this is something that I've had thoughts about too, probably in the last like 6 months. What would be the value of bulking, reaching a body fat where your gains are pretty comfortable? You're not objectively obese yet, right? Like you got a little bit of extra fluff, but you're not in a terrible position yet. Your gains are good, you feel good, so you've bulked up to whatever percent that might be, maybe high teens, low 20s, something like that. What would be the value of bulking and recomping or bulking and maintaining, and then just temporarily, even just months, spending some time there and then saying, okay, it's time for the next 5 to 10 pounds. Do you think there would be any merit in that compared to bulking and cutting?
I think I can't say that there wouldn't be because of the way that I've done things. So personally, I never forced myself. Like I never said right now I'm bulking. I never said right now I'm cutting. All I ever did was have the mindset of I want to get stronger and I want to get better. And what that led me to was a very slow increase in body weight over the course of a decade, basically. So I started out, I was less than 120 pounds, I was 115 pounds, peak weight of like 175, and I'm sitting at about 170 right now. And none of that is really deliberate. None of that is I'm bulking. None of that is I'm cutting. And it's been kind of like, a little bit of up and down over the years, but
Oh
the
yeah.
but the graph has just kind of trended upward. And now I'm basically stable, and I think this is about the heaviest I would want to be for my frame size. But that's essentially what I've done because you've seen my leanness vary. You can see
Oh yeah.
if you look at pictures, you can see it vary over the years. So what I did was I basically main gain whatever recomp we'll call it recomp
Sure, sure.
the entirety of my training career. So yeah, I can't disagree with that notion because I've experienced it.
Awesome. Awesome. Do you think there's a genuine like problem or like a common problem where people bulk too far and cut too hard? Like they get themselves into trouble with that? Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
Uh, not not from what I've seen. I mean, maybe like I'm not I'm not super entrenched into the like bodybuilding side of it or the aesthetics side of it. So maybe I'm not seeing those people. But I would think that's like damn, what was his name? Like somebody like George Lehman, right? That super strong deadlift. Do you know who he is? He had like an American record for the deadlift. He deadlifted like 900 plus pounds, but he bulked up. He was like 400 pounds, and people were like, "Oh, you're so freaking fat. You look terrible." And then he cut a bunch of weight, and everybody was like, "Oh my god, you're so jacked. You look awesome." But people didn't think he could do it. But basically, the point is like those are very extreme cases, in my opinion. It's not something that you really see very often. What you end up actually seeing is somebody just yo-yoing between the same, like, I'm 170, now I'm 160, now I'm 170, now I'm 160. Like, they bulk up a little bit. They think they look bad. So they cut down, then
Okay.
they feel weak,
Yeah.
then they bulk
Yeah.
back up. And they just never really make they just spin their wheels because of that. That is more common in my experience.
Yeah. Afraid to see the top two or the bottom two abs disappear just a little bit, right?
Right.
Checking the mirror every day, looking at social
Right.
media, comparing themselves. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a pretty valid concern. I guess in my own experience, this isn't a client. This is just like a one-off anecdote, but I remember I had an Uber driver one time, and we were talking away, nice guy, and he was talking about bulking and cutting, and he was basically, I forget the numbers he put out, but it was like he would go 30 pounds up, basically, and like 25 to 30 pounds down. So, and this would be within a year, so a fairly big change in the directions, fairly big change. And I'd ask him how he felt and that process, and he didn't seem too fond of that process. So I just told him, hey, just narrow that in, right? Like, don't go quite as high, don't cut quite as low,
Right.
like, and I asked him too, where do you feel best? And sure enough, it was somewhere in the middle of that, like, 30-pound net change. It's like, okay, well, if you could hover closer to that throughout the year, you might feel better. I never heard back from that Uber driver, but I hope he took that advice. So
It's possible.
uh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, with myself, I have no interest in like cutting down super low. There's something about coming back from cutting that you have to be mentally prepared for that. I think Jeffrey and Alex have done a really good job of that. That those guys are just such like workhorses in the gym
Right.
that they've got the mindset to be like, yeah, I've lost some muscle, I'm weaker. Don't get carried away, don't get injured. Just put the work in, and it's going to come back. There's something to be said about, and this would be interesting to talk about too, muscle memory. Like, I'm a big believer
Yeah.
in muscle memory. It's like a really important factor that you can take advantage of even as you get older, even as you get more experience. I think it plays a huge role. So even when people that I've seen like get injured or demoralized and they just stop training because they lose motivation and discipline, or even with cutting, like, things come back pretty quick if you put the time in. You put the work in.
Right. Well,
So
I hit my lifetime best squat came 10 months after hip surgery. And that was with, I couldn't even, maybe it was more like 12 months, but I couldn't squat for the first 4 to 5 months after surgery. I was allowed to start deadlifting sooner, but I wasn't allowed to squat until at least the 5 month mark, I think is what it was. And so I started with my best before that was 500. And I started with 225 when I resumed my journey post hip surgery. And that led me that once I got comfortable with the movement again, I started getting a very rapid. Once I was able to get heavy weights on the bar, I started experiencing pretty rapid gains until I was right back up to PR levels. And then finally, after having been stagnant for years, I ended up getting up 515, 520, 530. I hit a string of PRs within like a couple weeks of each other. And that was leading into a powerlifting meet.
yeah, that's
But
crazy.
a 5 month hiatus or a 6 month hiatus forced me into some of the best gains that I've ever gotten. It's kind of ironic, but that speaks, I think, to your muscle memory thing. Like, it all came back very quickly. And because I had been so detrained, I was finally able to hit new thresholds, which is interesting.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think
Yeah.
it would work that way, but it did.
Well, and from my experience, Alec, it's not something that you really lose with age. Like, I've had the pleasure to work with people who are in their 70s, and even a guy who's in his 90s. And one of my clients this year that I worked with throughout the spring, 70 years old, and he got the virus, and the virus set him back on his progress a good bit, right? Like, he was out of it for probably close to 2 weeks, and he was
Okay.
feeling pretty weak, as you'd expect. Lost a bit of weight, so maybe we can infer there's some muscle loss there, plus the time spent off training. And sure enough, within 2 to 3 weeks, it was like bing, bang, boom, PRs across the board. And his body felt pretty good. It wasn't even like, it wasn't like he was inadequately prepared for the stress of going back to that stuff, whether it was his
Right.
biceps curl, shoulder press. And, for him, he thought, I didn't realize I could make these gains, period, at this age, but also be able to bounce back and get right back into it in the
Right.
early 70s. That's awesome, right? So, yeah, there's something about this whole, oh, I'm too old, right? Like, that mindset is just, I mean, that is killer. Like that's going to age you. Thinking you're too old to do things, I think that ages people, man. I don't know.
I would agree with that. But that's kind of the cool part about training too, about regarding your client and his bounce back. The more that you have, in my experience, the more years that you have under the bar, the more, basically the longer, if you didn't want to train, the longer of gaps that you can take without really losing anything,
Yeah.
and the more easily that you get back into it. So I have like a few young guys, they'll take a deload week, they'll come back and they'll tell me, well, that first session, the leg DOMs is crippling, right? Like I can't walk today. And you're like, I remember that, but that doesn't happen to me anymore. I could take off 2 weeks and then I could go hit a 20 rep squat set and my legs would be sore, but they wouldn't be half as sore as they used to be when I was 20 years old. And that's like, I guess that's just a consequence of just work over the years. Just your body becomes more acclimated and a little bit more resilient overall, which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, you, Alec, you're also sadistic with some of your training, doing these like high rep squats. I saw you after Paris Butler posted his 20 front squats with 225. You did yours in less time. That was awesome. I mean, that was like I wanted to vomit just looking at that. So,
well, we ended up at 250 is what we ended up with. He took a 25-pound jump from we did 225 for 20, and then he took a 25-pound jump up to 250, which I thought was crazy, but I ended up hitting that one for 20 reps too. So I was kind of glad that he forced me to make that big jump because it's not something I would have done otherwise. But yeah, that was fun.
yeah, and that leads into something that people talk about too, about like especially natty, like keeping natty muscle or just keeping muscle in general, like more advanced maintenance, right? You can expect to maintain a lot of muscle because you've put in so much time, so much work, all these reps, all these sets. Like it's just going to stay. And I've noticed that as well. Like I don't, maybe I feel it more in my strength if I have time off of training for whatever reason, sick, injured, you name it, vacation, that sort of thing. Like, but I don't see it. I don't see it, and it's not even necessarily reflected in the scale. So, like, there's something about that temporary weakness. Don't let it get in your head because it's going to go away pretty quick, right? Yeah.
Yes, I agree with that 100%. I think the main contributor to that is just the nervous system becoming deacclimated to motor patterns. I think that's the main reason why, if you were to take a week or two off, that you're going to experience a strength decrease. I'm sure there's other factors as well, but I think that's probably the biggie right there. And all that takes is a couple weeks and it's gone. You're back to normal. So it's something that it is a message that I try to instill in people too, because you do see that a lot. Somebody will come back from a deload and they'll panic and they'll be like, what's going on? The weights feel heavy today. And I'm like, that's normal.
Totally.
I mean, I was so dumb when I was younger that I stopped deloading because I was like, well, why would I deload if I'm weaker when I come back from the deload? That doesn't make any damn sense. But that's kind of like missing the big picture there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, there's something to be said about getting advanced. Now, I try not to get too caught up in like definitions of, I mean, obviously we know what a beginner is, but like intermediate, advanced, elite, all this stuff. Or strength standards like, oh, you hit this number, congratulations, you're this now, right? But at the same time, there's something about the beginner, aside from unforeseen circumstances like injuries and sick and whatnot, like they're going to keep getting progress. Whereas as you get more advanced, as you know, there are sacrifices to be made. There's the whole concept of periodization where you can focus on something for a slotted amount of time, and then that focus and shift emphasizes. There's something to be said about when you get more experience, you can expect, I would just say, there is a point in your training where you're not hitting PRs all the time, or you're not at your peak strength all the time. And that's okay. Right. Don't let that get in your mind, because you will have to strike maybe somewhat of a trade-off between, maybe in some cases it's squat and deadlift, overhead press, bench press, obviously leanness versus size, things like that. Like there has to be some trade-off, but like you're saying, the big picture, it's all going up in 5 years, right? If you're doing things right. But it's hard to see that in a month. And it's hard for that to not get in your head sometimes, especially as you're just starting to experience those diminishing returns at first. That can really get in your head. So So yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Now,
that's a pretty. Go ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's a pretty common thing as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Now, on the note of training experience, what do you think some of the biggest mistakes that people who are starting to become more experienced, let's say intermediate to advanced, just kind of speak generally about that. What do you think their biggest mistakes tend to be?
Um, I mean, obviously, there's always going to be a factor of something being goal dependent, right? So whatever
Mhm.
I want to achieve is going to impact it. But just generally speaking, I think that what the biggest issue is people want to take they want to say, okay, I'm not a beginner anymore, so now I don't need simplistic programming. So what I want to do is I want to become advanced. But you don't want to become advanced because of just what you were saying. You don't really make that much progress when you're advanced, and you have to be very selective about what you're doing in order to make progress. And you have to kind of rotate through things cyclically in order to make progress. So I think the biggest mistake is people just they want to advance their programming before they need to. And I think that in many ways, simple linear periodization has gotten a bad reputation on the internet. And I think that's unfortunate because what I see is I can take somebody from nothing to what somebody else considers advanced using the most simplistic type of programming in existence just by waving it up and down correctly and applying the correct numbers to the process. But people think that it's too simple, right? It's so simple that it doesn't have value. It reminds me, I actually had somebody accuse me one time. I think this guy was getting poached by a different trainer, a trainer at the gym that he was working out at, and he showed the program that I wrote to the guy, and the guy basically told him, "Well, that's worthless. It's too basic essentially." And that guy couldn't have spent more than 5 minutes putting that program together. Never mind the fact that it always takes me way longer than that, but whatever. But it reminds me of so there's this story. Pablo Picasso gets approached by somebody on the street, and they ask him to make a painting, right? So he or a picture, or draw something for him. So he
Yeah,
has a
yeah.
napkin. He scribbles something down in 30 seconds, and he charges it. He says, "Here, if you want this, this will be, we'll just say $5,000." And the person goes, $5,000? That just took you 30 seconds to draw that picture. And he says, "No, it took me 30 years to be able to draw that picture in 30 seconds." And that's kind of the thing that people are missing. It's like there's a whole like swath of experience that somebody is drawing from. Just because something looks really easy or really simple or really basic doesn't mean that there's not like a whole conglomeration of things that went into it. And kind of getting a little bit off kilter here, but simplistic programming and people wanting to jump ahead of themselves
Yeah.
is probably the biggest issue that I see.
I I agree with that a lot. It's like, oh, what advanced techniques do I need to do? What type of
Right.
sets do I need to do? What type of exercise and what type of programming? It's like they people have bought into that somehow, like their physiology is like broken or like changed such that like just the basic
Right.
up and down of a rep with the right tonnages at the right time, like somehow that's not enough. Like it has to be
Right.
so much more. So add 5 new layers and elements to the program, right? It's advanced.
Right.
So, yeah, yeah, definitely.
Well, and even just trying to do things like a double, what the hell do we call it? A double progression, which
Yeah,
is a common thing, and it's a tactic that I use a lot too. But it's not something that's needed necessarily initially. And you see a lot of people who are just like, they obviously haven't been in the gym for all that long, and they want to do something like that, or they want to start talking about things like concurrent periodization, or even the conjugate program, the stuff that I wrote a whole freaking basically a book on at this point. And it's like you can do that, but I don't even start most people out on that. Even if I will start somebody out on that if that's what they want. But if somebody doesn't tell me that that's what they want, that's not where I start them. I almost always start somebody who wants to get bigger and stronger on a basic linear progression. It's just
yeah.
it's so simple and it works like very reliably.
When I had Stand Strength on the podcast, he said pretty similar thing that the
Okay.
the linear stuff gets a bad reputation, and it's not
Right.
necessarily justified. And I had my friend Aiden and Sue. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a pretty strong natty. He's around 25. He got up to, I think it was 565 deadlift last year, so pretty
Okay.
good, pretty good. And for him, it's like, yeah, after he loves to bulk and cut. After he cuts, he's going to come back with like a really simple, like linear progression on even like bench press and stuff. And as a guy who can, at his peak, he benched north of 3 plates. Like for him to still do that all these years into it, to rebound from his cut and build good strength and hit PRs using basic progression like that, maybe some double progression, doesn't have to get too complicated, right? You just need
No,
to
it
make
doesn't.
good choices in your programming, right? Like
Right.
what you do has to really reflect your ability. Like, and if you bite off more than you can chew, well, that's probably one of the biggest problems, right?
That is definitely one of the biggest problems. One thing I always tell people, we're going to take 2 steps back so that we can take 5 steps forward. And what you see is everybody wants to we're trying to run through a wall, right? And everybody is trying to run through the wall from right here. And you're never going to break the wall down if you're always starting from right here. You're just stuck. So you take a couple steps back, you get yourself a running start, and then you plow through the wall. And that seems to be a pretty reliable way to do things as well. A lot of people, like earlier in the game, they want to lift heavier than they need to. They don't end up waiving their training weight. Like they don't cycle through training weights appropriately in my experience. So once you kind of get those factors in place, that's really where you see like the numbers start to skyrocket. Like you have people come to you and say, I just want to squat and deadlift 300 pounds, right? I've been doing two whatever for years now. And then 6 months later, they're deadlifting 400 pounds. And they're like, holy shit. Well, yeah, that's what happens when you start applying the stimulus correctly.
So true, man. So true. Awesome. Is there any parting words or final things you'd like to say to the audience who's listening, knowing that, maybe this is a niche of YouTube fitness, people who are maybe past the beginner stage. Is there any words of encouragement or any wisdom you'd like to pass on to people who maybe are struggling, they're hitting plateaus, or are having doubts about the success of their programs? Anything you'd like to say to them?
uh, so I was going to talk about consistency. That's what I always talk about. But I think with that, talking about doubts. So what I've learned is it used to be like if I had a bad workout, I was like, that got me, that would ruin my whole day, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work like that for me anymore because what I've realized is it's just part of the process, right? Like you were saying, you can't always be at peak strength. You can't always have great workouts, and down ticks are a natural part of the game, especially when you are a natural lifter. It's just something that happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything wrong. And when you are diligent and when you follow the programming and you stay the course, eventually you work your way out of that valley and things start to trend upward again. So, see the don't let the darkness ruin your day. It's not the end of the world and you'll get out of that valley in time as long as you stay the course and do what needs to be done.
Fantastic message. Fantastic message. Now, obviously, you offer a coaching service as well. Are you taking on any new clients at the moment?
I'm pretty packed with clients at the moment, but I'll still do like custom programs. I still have templates and whatnot on my website, so like that conjugate manual, but also my my ultimate performance manual is just basically like the hybrid athlete type of concept that I talk about. And then I just have general strength and hypertrophy templates as well. So I got a lot of other stuff, but I'm pretty full on coaching at the moment.
Nice, nice. Well, guys, he definitely comes recommended. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Feel free to go follow Alec on Instagram and subscribe to him on YouTube. Thanks for listening today. And Alec, thank you for joining me. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me, man. I'll do it again sometime.